Today let's knit this sideways knitted baby hat. Later in the movie, I'll also show you how to make other hat sizes using the same technique. The hat matches this cute baby blanket using the same number 4 yarns. But the hat uses a different gauge because hat fabric should ideally be considerably firmer than blanket fabric. This knitting board has 7/16 inch spacing center to center on the pegs. I got a gauge and fabric that I like using the narrowest dimension of this wooden spacer. The fabric is 4 stitches, 4.5 rows per inch on one face of the fabric. You can match the gauge on other knitting boards if you don't have this exact one by following the instructions in this movie. Anytime I mention another movie that you might need to consult, there will be a link for you in the program notes so that you can find it easily. So let's get right into knitting the hat. I've cast on 20 stitches, hung the anchor cord, knitted the row after the anchor cord, and that will all count as the cast on. Now we need to knot a loop into the contrasting yarn, and we're going to knit that color every single row on pegs 3 and 4 of both boards. So we'll knit those over before we wrap the main color. Now my yarn tail from starting that color can be laid down between the boards if you want to, or you can weave it in later. But my yarn supply needs to come out between pegs 3 and 4. Now we're going to wrap the main color almost with the usual stockinette wrap. This should be my first peg, and it will be, but I will skip the pegs that were involved with the second color because they've already been knitted for this row. Zigzag to and fro across as usual with the stockinette wrap, making an exception when we get to these pegs that have already been utilized. Wrap, wrap, wrap. And here's my last stitch. For this design, I prefer my last stitch to be on the front at the left. Knit all these over. And you know how to knit over, so I will do this super speedily. Okay, that's row 1 of the 2-row repeat. Each row begins by wrapping the 2 contrasting color sets of pegs. I prefer to figure 8 wrap them, but really any configuration will work okay. Here it is again to show you what I prefer to do. It's important that the strand of yarn that's still working emerge from between pegs 3 and 4 on the board nearest you. Those 4 stitches get knitted over first. We'll knit them over just as for all other rows. We'll always do this. The working yarn's coming out from between these 2 pegs. This row gets treated just like the previous one with one difference. Row 2, we treat the contrasting spaces just as we did before. But we're only going to knit 14 pegs total. There's the 14th. So this is a short row. Literally, it's shorter than the others. We're leaving 6 stitches not worked this row. Skip the contrasting color stitches. Last peg is the one on the front. And knit everything over where there is something to knit over. But there won't be anything on the last 6 pegs to the right. because we didn't wrap them. I'll knit these over lickety-split, and we're ready for a row 1 again. First, wrap and knit the 4 contrasting pegs, 2 on the front, 2 on the back. The figure 8 sort of shape works well for me, but it isn't essential. It's not very fussy because we're holding the fabric together by the fact that this knits straight across. This strand of yarn that I'm wrapping now is continuous, never gets interrupted, so we won't have holes in the fabric. And we can just bypass these pegs with the main color with impunity. And this was another row 1. As you see, I wrapped all the way to the end. So we'll knit over all the way to the end. The entire hat is made by alternating rows 1 and 2. As you work, the knitting will begin to form a crescent shape. This will be the crown, and this will be the hem. The cast on and the bind off will be sewn together, and then the narrow edge, the crown edge, gathered up to finish the hat. If you're a relatively new knitter and need some help with the normal double board stockinette cast on and bind off, you'll find that help in these 2 movies. Here's the shape that we're knitting. This will be the hem edge, this will be the top of the crown, and we'll gather it together. For an infant hat, I like it to be 5 inches from the top of the crown to the bottom of the hem and 14 inches in circumference. So this hat is made with 20 stitches and 63 rows. We need to end with a row 1, a complete row, so that works out perfectly. Although many people like negative ease in hats, meaning if your head is 22 inches around, you actually want your hat smaller by up to 2 inches, I do not recommend it for infants, and I do not recommend it for sideways knitted hats because they don't have the degree of stretch as vertically knitted hats do. Here's how to adjust the pattern for other sizes. We'll pretend we're making a hat for me. I like mine 21 inches around and 8 inches tall. That's a small adult hat size. So for the number of stitches to cast on, we'd multiply my 8 inches times the stitch gauge. My hat needs to be 32 stitches. For the circumference, we'd multiply my 21-inch head measurement by 4.5, the row gauge in rows per inch. Obviously, 94.5 rows is impractical, and we need to end with a row number 1. That's true in all sizes because it's best to begin with a full row and end with a full row so that your cast on and bind off will be as smooth as possible for seaming together. Therefore, I would choose to knit myself 95 rows. You can use this same simple arithmetic formula to adjust in case your gauge is not identical to mine. If you're getting a nice fabric, that's fine. You don't have to match my gauge perfectly. Simply adjust your stitch and row count according to the gauge you are getting. The hat we've just knitted together is using basically the same techniques as this one in my Picture This book, which is available on Ravelry. It's just that the color work in the flower hat is slightly more elaborate. Nothing difficult though, so you might want to check that out. So let's finish up this hat. Here's the last time we use the contrasting color, and the yarn tail can be laid down between the boards if you like to automatically weave in. Here's the last row of the main color. Bind off beginning at the side away from the yarn tail. Finish the cast on and remove the anchor cord. Seam the cast on and bind off together. And here I'm using the same method as I would use up the edge of the fabric. This will not be as invisible a seam, but it will be quite flat, and I think it's most appropriate to the fabric. After knotting the top of the seam, run the remainder of the thread through the very top edge, the narrow edge, to gather it in. Turn the hat inside out, and from the inside, stitch across the O a couple of times to secure it. Weave in all your tails, and voila, a hat. Here it is from all angles. My doll is actually real newborn size, but newborns are just like the rest of us. They vary quite a bit. So you will notice the hat is a little long on this doll. I think it's best to do it like that so that the child doesn't instantly outgrow the hat.